Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, John A. Blues, and with this video, I'll be discussing my thoughts on the series finale of the anime series Satsuriku no Tenshi, or Angels of Death. And what largely motivated this video discussion was the ambiguity with which some people seem to feel the final scenes in the finale episode are permeated with. And I think they were largely open to interpretation, but I think there wasn't a whole lot of wiggle room into how many interpretations one could have. And I think a lot of the confusion that was resultant from this seeming ambiguity is really unnecessary. I think there's only so many ways you can actually take the finale episode and those final scenes, and that's very pointedly what I want to talk about in this video discussion. Let me get it out of the way right away and say this is a remake video discussion because I was largely dissatisfied with my original video talking about this particular topic. There were some problems in the editing where I had effectively edited out an entire chunk of speculation that I feel was probably that much closer to the mark from how one is supposed to interpret those final scenes. And the primary factor that did not make it into my first fully uploaded video discussion on this topic was the fact that, I had initially assumed in those final scenes of the finale episode that when Rachel had received the crushing blow revelation that for all intents and purposes Zach, her partner in crime throughout the course of the series, had been sentenced to death and likely that sentencing had carried out, was that she returned to her bed and, after many sleepless nights beforehand, she had nothing left, as she says in her monologue, to do but close her eyes. And thus that's what we see her do. She lays down in her bed again. In the facility she now finds herself contained within and seemingly goes to sleep for the first time in a very long time. And my initial interpretation of that sequence was that she probably died right then and there in her bed. She had given up on life and her body just, withered away and died, and everything that had followed, all of the sort of hallucinogenic interpretation of Zach crashing through the window, coming to make good on his promise with her, the promise that they both shared going back to their initial meeting, were largely for the benefit of her own satisfaction as well as we the viewers, who had followed the course of these two characters coming together and having a tumultuous, time of it, trying to escape the facility and making good on the promise that Zach would end Rachel's life per her own wishes. I had gone on to say that I had surmised, because of the post-credits sequence where they pan down and show that there is a knife on her floor, I had discussed the knife in a sort of metaphorical format, thinking that there wasn't really a knife there, that this was the transfer of power between Zach and Rachel, in effect, toward the end of the series, knowing that they would probably be split apart, they probably would not be able to so easily reunite, and this was the transference of power back to Rachel's own hand, in sort of giving her a piece of himself. This was his knife. This was a knife that I think he said was his first bladed weapon, or he carried out his first murder with, or something along those lines. And I believe with that element, there was birthed in her mind's eye this equivalent version of Zach, for if it became necessary that they would not be reunited, that she could call upon, that could effectively help her take her own life. And in her own mind, it would be Zach's carrying it out and doing it of his own accord, much as was their promise. So in my fully uploaded video discussion, I had said, my surmise was, because we saw the knife in that final post-credits scene, this was just meant to equate the fact that Zach had transferred the power back to Rachel, because it seemed to be a point of conflict for Rachel to then commit suicide, to take her own life, which seemed to be largely something she was unwilling and unwanting to do. She only subsisted on the fact that Zach promised he would eventually take her life in her stead. And so, to take it a step further, I had even gone on to say that I suspected she somehow found a means to break through the window of her room in this facility she was now contained in, taking sort of for granted the fact that there were bars on the window. She had somehow, found a way to break through the window and leapt to her death, all the while hallucinating that this was Zach's doing. And so I had a comment on my original video saying, well, the only question left over hanging in thinking of it that way is the bars that were on the window. And so I had also gone on to speculate in my comment on that video, in reply to the person who brought this up, that maybe the knife had in fact been there and wasn't strictly metaphorical, to emphasize the idea that there was this transference of power back into Rachel's own hand so that she could take her own life with Zach existing within her own mind, Because if we went back and looked at earlier scenes in that episode, there was a point where Rachel was left to her own devices in the garden, for all intents and purposes, of this mental health facility she now found herself in. And she had gone wandering and heard part of a radio broadcast, which led me to believe that Zach's sentencing of death had been carried out. She only hears part of this, but it's coming from an open window in the courtyard of this facility. She could have very easily, in the blink of an eye, in scenes that were edited that we did not see, reached into that room and found a knife. Not necessarily the knife that Zach had given her, but maybe it was one and the same. And, she could have snuck this knife to her room. And if we took anything from the last few episodes of this particular series, it's that for anyone with a bladed weapon, metal bars, be they guardrails or on windows, were analogous to paper with anyone with a bladed weapon. As we saw, Zach took his scythe and managed to destroy the bars that almost kept them from escaping the facility that they had been in the entirety of the series. So it was my estimation, after thinking about it a little more, that perhaps she had stolen a knife, or the very knife that Zach had given her, and this allowed her to crash through the window and cut those bars off of the window and leap to her death. The blood that was resultant on the windowsill not being the ghostly apparition of Zach as she imagined it, because all of that was nonsensical. For Zach to have somehow escaped prison, escaped his sentencing of death, pinpointing where they were holding Rachel, finding the exact room she was held within, somehow elevating to whatever floor this was on the upper floors of this building to crash through the window and take her out, made absolutely no sense. It was completely absurd, to accept any of that as actually having transpired, because that would be the only thing that would allow her to commit suicide. It wasn't her own doing in her own mind. It was Zach's coming to rescue her in answer to that promise. And I think that final post-credits scene was meant to give us the tip of the hat to that. You could interpret it that she had laid back down and died in her sleep, having all of this, imaginary vision of Zach coming to rescue her and her own leaping out the window, if you so desire to interpret it that way. But I think more literally and more poignantly, because of the showcasing and emphasis that was placed on the knife, that she somehow got it into her possession. She somehow snuck it into her room. And this was the means by which she dispatched the bars on her window and committed suicide, having answered to the hopes and dreams of Zach's murdering her, taking her own life, so that she could die in a satisfying way to herself, answering to that promise laid between them. And as I had talked about in my original discussion video on this topic, this is really heavy subject matter, the idea of depression and suicidal thoughts and things of that nature. And as somebody who myself has suffered depression and at one time in my life suicidal thoughts in my past, I just wanted to put it out there for anyone who may be so suffering concurrently, or who may have had suicidal thoughts in their past, to at least consider taking a look at some suicide hotline information and website information, which I have listed in the description below, so as to hopefully seek out the help to get yourself on a better path and realize the value of your own life and things like that. For anyone who may be suffering thinking along those lines, and hopefully, that'll benefit you if you decide to check into it, if that's what you're going through. And with all that being said, I'd like to ask, if you enjoyed this video discussion and you'd like to see further video content like this in the future on my channel, please consider having a look at my PayPal contribution link posted in the description as well as the comments below. You have options that you can look into as far as sending me a monthly contribution, a one-time only kind of thing, or if you so desire, you can send me a personal message along with a contribution requesting topics that I may discuss in the future, as well as requesting shout-outs and things like that. And it would go a long way, far and away, to keeping up my longevity on YouTube, and would just be 2 thumbs up for me no matter what you decided to send my way. And with that being said, that'll be pretty much it for me on this. Hope this video finds you well, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.